Looking back through history, it's often difficult to see past events that have so shaped our modern world. The story of Japan in World War II, for example, has often left those in the West with an impression that prior to 1945, Japan was always an enemy of freedom. While in fact, while we associate Imperial Japan as Hitler's ally, just 20 years earlier, Japan fought against the Kaiser and that particular tyrant's quest for power. In this episode, we are going to explore Japan's entry into the First World War and examine its navy's intriguing, if often forgotten role in safeguarding the Mediterranean Sea from the Kaiser's fleet of U-boats. Welcome to Wars of the World. Japan was rather unique in terms of Asian nations at the start of the 20th century, in that it was one of the few not subjugated either directly or indirectly by the European empires of Britain, France, Germany, Holland, or Russia. Much of the Asian continent had fallen under the banners of one of these great powers, who at the same time wrestled with the Chinese for economic or strategic influence, either through trade, treaty, or outright warfare. The Japanese, meanwhile, being isolated on their home islands, were free to undergo a major social and technological change in the 18th century, abolishing the old feudal systems that had left the nation's loyalties divided, and adopting more and more industry, much of which was imported from the West. Thus, by the 1900s, Japan was every bit a modern nation looking to expand its reach outward and become the first true global Asian power. Almost mirroring the expansion of the European empires centuries before, Japan seized nearby territories, annexing the island of Taiwan in 1895, and was soon making inroads towards territory in nearby Manchuria and the Korean peninsula. Being an island nation, the Japanese inevitably built a powerful navy, much to the alarm of some of the old European powers, and in particular, Imperial Russia. However, Japan was not alone in its rivalry with Moscow. The British Empire was also concerned about Russian expansion, particularly regarding India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And on the basis of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," the two nations signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, primarily to curtail Russian ambitions in the region. Ultimately, diplomacy kept London and Moscow from going to war, but Japan felt it was left with no choice, and in 1904, the two powers clashed over territory in East Asia. The war would last a year and a half, during which it was believed that Russia would inevitably defeat the Japanese, since no Asian empire had been able to resist the advance of the Europeans before. It thus came as a shock to the established world order when not only did Japan seize victory, but it did so decisively, particularly concerning the war at sea, where the Imperial Japanese Navy decimated the Russian Navy at the Battle of Tsushima. Japan emerged from the war as a new nation with newfound respect and a reinvigorated nationalist spirit. 5 years later, it proceeded with the annexation of Korea and renewed its treaties with Britain, and thus when the war in Europe broke out in the summer of 1914, Japan felt compelled to side with the British against Germany, declaring war on Berlin on August 23, 1914. For the leadership in Tokyo, the war was an opportunity to seize more power and territory in Asia, without invoking the ire of the other empires by attacking Germany's holdings in the region, specifically Kyushu province in China, and various German-held islands in the Micronesian island chain. With the Kaiser's fleet boxed in at home by the Royal Navy, and his armies slogging it out against Britain, France, and Russia, there was little the German ruler could do to stop Japan. The most significant ground operation the Japanese undertook against Germany was an attack on the port city of Tsingtao, which housed the German Navy's comparatively small China Squadron. The attack was carried out with British support, and the city soon fell. Japan was asked to send troops to Europe as the fighting became bogged down in the trenches, but this request was refused. although Japanese warships did begin escorting Australian and New Zealand troop ships across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to protect them from German, Austro-Hungarian or Ottoman warships and submarines. With the war in Europe looking set to go on for the foreseeable future, Japan again used its advantage to secure its new and influential position. On January 18, 1915, Japan issued its 21 demands to Chinese President Yuan Shikai, which, if granted, would afford Japan similar special privileges in China, which were already enjoyed by European powers. The demands called for the confirmation of Japan's railway and mining claims in Shandong province, the granting of special concessions in Manchuria, Sino-Japanese control of the Han Yi-Ping mining base in central China, access to harbors, bays, and islands along China's coast, and finally, Japanese influence in Chinese financial, political, and police affairs. Yuan was outraged, but Britain and France, despite their own trepidations over Japan's growing strength, were more concerned with keeping Japan on side in the war, and so Yuan had no choice but to agree to all but one of the demands, the exception being the last, the demand concerning Japanese influence in internal Chinese affairs. However, the political situation in Tokyo threatened to derail Japan's close links with Britain, which up until then had been championed by Japanese Foreign Minister Kato Takaki, who believed that aligning with the British Empire would afford Japan both protection and support for its ambitions. However, other factions wanted to instead ally Japan with Russia, while the more nationalist factions saw the war as an opportunity to cast off the chains of Western imperialism once and for all, and to assert Japan as the dominant power in Asia. Kato thus found himself under attack from all directions in 1915, surviving a plot to oust him only to resign a few weeks later in an ultimately doomed effort to become Prime Minister. Instead, the premiership was taken on by General Terauchi Masatake on October 9, 1916, who continued to maintain the close ties with Britain, despite senior members of his cabinet pushing for closer ties with Japan's former enemy, Russia. Conferences were thus held between the two powers, but in the meantime, Terauchi was honor-bound to maintain previously established military cooperation with Britain. Japanese warships were still escorting convoys from Australia and New Zealand, as far as the British Protectorate in Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea, at the northern end of which was the Suez Canal and the gateway to the Mediterranean Sea. Britain never stopped looking to Japan for help in Europe, but Tokyo stubbornly refused to venture further than Aden. However, Japanese observers did serve in the Royal Navy to study modern naval warfare, and there were Japanese fatalities at the pivotal Battle of Jutland, fought on May 31st, 1916. Britain also at one point investigated the possibility of acquiring two of Japan's advanced Kongo-class battlecruisers, which had been designed in Britain, but again the effort came to nothing. In the meantime, the situation in the Mediterranean was going from bad to worse for the Allies. German U-boats had from the start of the war presented a threat to Allied shipping that far exceeded their simple cost and low numbers compared to the mighty British and French fleets. Fortunately, for much of the war, they had operated under a strict set of rules which required them to surface and inspect merchant ships before sinking them. But the Germans found these extremely limiting and dangerous for the crews with the introduction of British Q-ships, which were armed ships designed to imitate merchant vessels to lure in unsuspecting U-boat crews for the kill. German crews had begun to ignore the rules earlier in the war, but following the sinking of the Lusitania passenger liner by a U-boat on May 7, 1915, pressure from the then neutral United States forced the German Kaiser to halt the practice and return to abiding by the rules. By 1917, however, the German battle fleet had been bested by superior British numbers at Jutland, and the war on the land was still bogged down. German military leaders pressed the German ruler to authorize unrestricted submarine warfare to win the war. The primary goal was to stop the flow of war materials being transported to the British war's factories, which were keeping the country in the fight, much like how the Royal Navy was blockading German ports from receiving overseas aid. Convinced by the pleas of his generals and admirals, Kaiser Wilhelm II authorized his U-boats to sink any vessels bearing the flag of Germany's enemies without warning. For the British especially, this was a nightmare. Not only did shipping losses rise dramatically, but with them went both the needed war materials and food shipments for the British people. Even more effort had to be put into protecting convoys of ships, forcing even the numerically impressive Royal Navy to have to pull ships from other duties. In the wake of this development, the British again turned to the Japanese for help, but anticipating the same response as before, they came to a concession. They would help support Japan's claims to the former German territories it had seized after the war. This was too tempting for Terauchi to refuse, and so he instructed his admirals to assemble a special squadron tasked with entering the Mediterranean to protect Allied shipping. Dubbed the 2nd Special Squadron, command was handed to Rear Admiral Saito Kozo. Born in Morioka City on May 15, 1871, Sato's family descended directly from Japan's warrior nobility, the samurai. Graduating from Japan's Naval Academy in 1891, he specialized in naval gunnery, spending some time in England studying the Royal Navy's techniques before serving as the chief gunnery officer aboard the cruiser Azuma during the war with Russia. Sato's squadron initially comprised of the 18-year-old, 2,657-ton Suma-class cruiser Akashi and 8 Kaba-class destroyers, divided into 2 flotillas, the 10th and the 11th destroyer flotillas. The 655-ton Kaba-class were among some of the most modern destroyers in the Japanese Navy at the time, having been ordered in 1914 as a direct result of the outbreak of the war, and demonstrated how advanced the Imperial Japanese Navy was at this time, even compared to its Western contemporaries. After the squadron assembled in Singapore, then still under the British Empire, the force set sail for the Mediterranean, passing through Colombo in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, Aden, and Port Said, Egypt, before arriving in Malta on April 16, 1917. Their arrival was welcomed by their Western allies, as losses to U-boats had soared by this time, with some 379 ships, totaling 582,070 tons, sunk in the previous month alone. However, confidence in the Asian fleet was still somewhat low amongst British and French admirals, who were still struggling to accept that a non-European nation's navy could in any way match their own in equipment or in professionalism. Once in the Mediterranean theatre, Sato's squadron settled into the routine of escorting troop ships heading from Malta to Salonika in Greece, and from Alexandria, Egypt, to Taranto, Italy, and Marseille, France. Despite their initial concerns, the Western navies were soon in awe of the Japanese fleet's efficiency, their ships being able to generate extremely high serviceable rates, and their crews proving well-trained and highly disciplined. However, there was a feeling that they were yet to be truly tested. That day would eventually come on May 4th, 1917. 2 of the squadron's destroyers, the Matsu and the Sakaki, were tasked with escorting the requisitioned Cunard liner, HMT Transylvania, which was acting as a troop ship, carrying men and equipment on the Marseille to Alexandria run. The 14,348-ton liner was barely 3 years old when it, along with its 2 Japanese escorts, left Marseille on May 3rd. Shortly before 1000 hours the next morning, the troop ship was just 2 miles from shore as it sailed south of Cape Vado in the Gulf of Genoa, when U-boat captain Otto Schulze spied it and the destroyer escort through his periscope aboard U-63. Schulze fired a torpedo, and despite the Transylvania making 14 knot speed and taking a zigzag course, the troop ship was hit in the port engine room. Immediately, the Japanese destroyers sprang into action, and with the Matsu coming alongside the Transylvania to render what assistance it could as the wounded liner turned for the nearby shore, where, if necessary, it could be beached to prevent it from sinking. Meanwhile, the Sakaki went in pursuit of its attacker. For nearly 20 minutes, the Japanese destroyer hunted for the U-boat, but then, suddenly, found itself under attack, as a torpedo was observed racing towards them. Only the quick reactions of the crew spared it from being hit, the engines having been thrown into a full astern to get the ship out of the line of fire. But sadly, the torpedo instead carried on and hit the Transylvania again. The troop ship, now having been hit twice, began to sink slowly. The Japanese destroyers aided in the evacuation before the ship sank beneath the waves, barely an hour after the attack began. Of the 3,400 personnel on board, 270 were killed. However, the British Admiralty recognized that were it not for the actions of the 2 Japanese destroyers, the death toll may have been significantly higher. This was reflected in a letter they sent to Rear Admiral Sato, thanking his men and highlighting their professionalism in the incident, despite the loss of the Transylvania. Indeed, the feelings regarding the Japanese fleet were now firmly positive ones, particularly for the British. For as Commander Gerald C. Dickens, Flag Commander to the Commander-in-Chief of the British Mediterranean Fleet, would eventually report back to London, where his opinion on the Italians were inefficient, the French unreliable, and the Americans, who recently entered the war, were too far away. The Japanese were excellent, but small in number. Dickens' last point was realized quickly, and efforts were made to reinforce Sato's fleet. In the meantime, the Japanese squadron would directly feel the sting of modern submarine warfare, when on June 11, 1917, the Sakaki was sailing off the coast of Crete, when it was sighted by the Austro-Hungarian submarine U-27 and attacked. This time, there was no escape for the destroyer, which sustained a hit near its fore magazine. In the resulting blast and fire, 68 crew members, roughly 2/3 of the ship's total complement, were killed, including the ship's captain, Commander Taichi Uehara. Miraculously, however, despite the damage, the ship was saved from sinking and was eventually repaired and returned to service. Reinforcements for Sato would come in the form of 4 Momo-class destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 15th Destroyer Flotilla. The Momo-class ships were even newer than the Kabas, the oldest being less than 2 years old when they set sail from Japan on June 25th, bound for the Mediterranean. This allowed Sato to increase his squadron's overall contribution to the war effort in the Mediterranean, despite the loss of the Sakaki while it was still being repaired. Then in November 1917, the 7,700-ton cruiser Nishin, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, and which had fought at Tsushima, was also transferred to the Mediterranean, Sato soon transferring his flag to this vessel. Throughout the remainder of the war, the Japanese squadron in the Mediterranean continued their vital escort work, escorting a total of 788 Allied ships on their journeys, and aiding in the safe transport of 700,000 troops. They encountered German and Austro-Hungarian submarines on 38 separate occasions, and while the Japanese never sank any, their efforts in harrying them no doubt prevented further losses to the underwater menace. By the time of the armistice on November 11, 1918, Japan was a major player on the world stage and in the peace talks. In recognition of their sacrifice, in 1918, a memorial was built at the Commonwealth War Graves in Malta, commemorating the 78 Japanese sailors who fell in the Mediterranean, with 73 of them being buried there. Sadly, the memorial was destroyed by a German air raid during the Second World War, and would not be reconstructed until 1973. Despite the high regard the Imperial Japanese Navy had earned with their contribution during the war, once the guns fell silent and they were not needed anymore, the old European powers and the United States eyed Japan suspiciously. For them, the war had demonstrated that Tokyo was not only hungry for more power and would do what was necessary to acquire it, but its naval power was also not to be taken lightly, and could prove a genuine threat to Pacific shipping if hostilities broke out. Thus, when the world's powers tried to prevent another Great War by establishing treaties designed to limit the warships a nation could field, Japan felt shortchanged by London and Washington, who were afforded much larger fleets. This despite Japanese forces fighting and dying on the side of the Allies. This act, coupled with a resurgent sense of nationalism, militarism, and destiny, which had been fostering since Tsushima, established an environment whereby anti-Western sentiment would only grow, until the next generation of Japanese were ready to destroy the empires from across the seas in Asia and create their own empire that would spread the flag of the rising sun across China, the Pacific, and beyond.